What we need is trade and opportunity. Right now, we're at a 20% price disadvantage to the tariffs and the trade war to our counterparts in South America, and that just makes us uncompetitive and makes us lose the market. And we need a change, and we need it now.
It is an insult that African countries do import food items from countries that are disadvantaged in terms of quality of soil, in terms of quality of weather conditions, in terms of all indicators. Go there, bring food to Africa. It's not acceptable anymore. The idea of producing massively in the farms and shipping them in raw form without adding value must stop. That is what they call mental slavery and entrepreneurial slavery, because it's half-baked.
Nigeria now, the country's government spent $4.65 billion on food importation, and that's between January and September 20. That is a 62% rise compared to the previous year. Well, CGTN's Kelechi Emekalam reports that the increase in food costs was despite the West African nations imposing a land border closure, which was aimed at boosting local production.
Something unbelievable just happened and almost nobody is talking about it. One of the world's biggest food suppliers just got completely locked out of an entire continent. Shipments stopped, deals frozen, contracts canceled overnight. $1 billion vanished not from Africa but from across the ocean. Farmers who were struggling just months ago are now celebrating because the tables have turned. Local producers are filling markets that were once dominated by foreign food shipments. But here's the shocking part. A certain powerful world leader didn't see this coming at all. Trade routes collapsing, political tension rising. Grocery prices shifting, and economic power moving faster than anyone expected. This isn't just about chicken or grain anymore. It's about who controls the world's food supply and who just lost their grip. So how did this happen? What deals collapsed behind closed doors? And why might this decision send shockwaves through global trade for years? Stay with me because what you're about to hear changes everything. The world woke up to something that felt unreal. No press conference countdown. No official announcement trending online. Just one quiet trade decision. Making waves across oceans. Within hours, shipping schedules were erased. Cargo contracts were suspended. Food distributors scrambled to reroute their massive shipments as refrigerated containers sat idle at major ports. An entire continent had made a choice, and across the Atlantic, $1 billion disappeared almost overnight. For decades, American food exports flowed freely into African markets. Poultry, wheat, soy, corn built into global supply chains so stable that no one imagined they could suddenly snap. But this morning was different. Tweets turned frantic. Commodity traders watched prices glitch and jump. Agri-news outlets rushed out urgent updates, claiming temporary market adjustments. Everyone tried to soften what just happened, but the truth spread anyway. Africa had started turning away from U.S. food imports, and the people celebrating weren't politicians. They were farmers. Local farmers who for years struggled to compete against massive subsidized foreign shipments now found something they hadn't felt in a generation: relief, opportunity, control. Yet across the ocean, reaction was very different. Inside the U.S. agricultural sector, panic set in. Farm organizations called emergency meetings. Export councils fired off letters to lawmakers. Cold storage facilities filled with surplus poultry that had suddenly lost its destination market. Trade officials insisted the situation was temporary. But markets don't wait for reassurance. They react to reality, and reality was simple. A once reliable export lane had just shut down. This story didn't begin last week, it began years ago. Quietly, Africa's dependence on imported food wasn't an accident. It developed from trade policies designed to create affordable supply. Foreign producers, especially from the United States, could ship food cheaply due to heavy agricultural subsidies and industrial scaling. African farmers, working without the same financial cushions, struggled to compete against prices that barely covered shipping costs. Over time, local poultry farms collapsed, wheat fields were abandoned, small cooperatives disbanded. Imported food became the default: cheaper, more abundant, more predictable. But dependence always carries a price. Domestic agriculture weakened, food sovereignty vanished, and governments began to worry. What happens if those imports stop? The question remained imaginary. Until it wasn't. Across major African economies, agricultural leaders started asking new questions. Why are we feeding our people with other countries' harvests, while our lands sit underused? Why are our farmers poor while foreign exporters profit from our grocery shelves? Why are we so vulnerable to pricing shifts far outside our borders? The answers were uncomfortable, so reforms began quietly. Domestic subsidies grew, protective import policies were drafted. Pan-African trade agreements prioritized local sourcing. Training programs scaled up poultry, maize, and soybean production. Cold chain storage investments reduced waste. Domestic milling operations expanded. This wasn't designed to create confrontation. It was designed to create independence. But independence always clashes with established powers. Then came the turning point. Stricter import standards were enforced. New requirements, biosecurity rules, health certifications, labeling audits suddenly went live. On paper, they looked ordinary. In reality, they slowed import flows dramatically. Some shipments failed inspections. Others became economically unviable under the increased compliance costs. Gradually, trade slowed, then stopped. The numbers piled up. U.S. food exporters watched their sales projections fall hundreds of millions here, tens of millions there, until the losses crossed what analysts began calling the billion-dollar threshold. No official statement acknowledged the scale, but the markets knew, because traders don't exaggerate when money disappears. While American exporters calculated losses, African farmers watched demand soar. Broiler facilities ramped up poultry production. Wheat and maize acreage expanded rapidly. Soybean cooperatives increased planting by double digits. Local sourcing agreements appeared almost overnight. Retail chains signed new domestic supply contracts. Food markets changed their shelves. What was imported yesterday is now homegrown today. For the first time in decades, small farmers finally sold into stable markets with predictable pricing and reduced competition from subsidized imports. Villages that once exported youth to cities saw opportunity flow backward. Farm equipment suppliers got new orders. Transport companies expanded routes. Storage facilities hired workers. Agricultural employment rose quietly, not driven by charity but by profit. This was economic development the hard way. Not aid, not loans, but ownership. Across the Atlantic, the mood darkened. Large poultry processors faced sudden oversupply. Grain exporters had shipments with nowhere to go. Cold warehouses filled with unsold inventory. Farm cooperatives saw payments delayed or canceled outright. Some producers were forced to slaughter surplus livestock early, taking losses that could not be recovered. Prices dropped domestically as supply exceeded consumption. Rural communities already under strain felt the squeeze deepen, because when exports fall, farm incomes fall, equipment purchases slow, seasonal hiring stops, debt piles up. This wasn't geopolitical anymore, it was personal. Thousands of families suddenly felt the ripple of a distant decision they had zero control over. Inside U.S. political circles, surprise turned into tension. Trade advisors urged emergency negotiations. Export councils demanded intervention. Lobby groups pushed for retaliatory tariffs, but publicly, silence dominated. No leader wanted to amplify the story. Acknowledging it meant recognizing a shift in global food power, and that's a hard thing to admit, that a continent once dependent now holds leverage. This wasn't isolated. Africa had already been cooperating more closely with Asian, Middle Eastern, and South American food partners, diversifying supply lines years before tensions rose. This gave nations the confidence to pivot away from old monopolies. By choosing independence over dependency, Africa risked short-term instability, but gained long-term control, and control over food means control over politics, inflation, and national security. Because a hungry nation cannot govern itself freely. Let's be honest, this wasn't America versus Africa. This was centralized agribusiness versus local farming communities on both sides of the ocean. When African agriculture wins, those profits stay in villages instead of boardrooms. But when industrial exporters lose, family farms back home feel the consequences, not corporations. The system is rigged in both directions, but the turning point changed something fundamental. Africa's farmers now control their domestic food supply, a victory decades in the making. Here's why this decision matters beyond headlines. Food independence leads to economic stability. When nations feed themselves, currency pressure drops, import spending shrinks, domestic employment grows, rural development strengthens. Over time, agriculture builds the foundation for manufacturing and export power. This is exactly how East Asia transformed decades ago, and Africa appears to be beginning the same journey. But that future won't be smooth. Price volatility will test patience. Climate shifts will stress harvests. Political pressure from foreign trade powers will intensify. But the direction is now set. Despite attempts to downplay the story, people noticed, news clips spread, farmers posted celebratory harvest footage, market analysts debated a global food realignment, online commentators asked the unthinkable. Is America losing its grip on agricultural dominance? No one gave a straight answer because the truth is uncomfortable. What makes this moment powerful isn't politics, it's dignity. For decades, African farmers were told they could never compete, never scale, never match international efficiency. But they did, not by copying foreign systems, but by building their own. On the other side of the ocean, American farmers who didn't create this system paid the price for global shifts they couldn't influence. This isn't a story of villains. It's a story of a world changing faster than people can adapt. Current trade negotiations remain frozen. Some limited shipments have resumed, but full-scale exports remain dramatically reduced. African domestic production is still rising. Local processing capacity continues to expand. This is not a temporary pause, it's a new direction. The billion-dollar loss is already written into quarterly reports. And there is no sign of a return to the old food order. Every era has its defining shift. Oil independence reshaped geopolitics. Technology independence reshaped economies. Now food independence may reshape everything next, when nations feed themselves. They do not bow easily to pressure, they negotiate as equals. And Africa is learning that power. The headlines call this a trade dispute. The markets call it a billion-dollar loss. But history may someday call it something else entirely. The moment Africa took back control of its food future. And as for that powerful leader who didn't see this coming, the shock wasn't in public speeches, it was in the silence that followed, because silence is what happens when power shifts suddenly and no one is ready to explain it. And when the noise fades, when the talking heads move on to the next crisis. This moment will still be here, because this story was never really about politics, it was about people. Farmers waking up before sunrise to walk through fields their families have worked for generations, not knowing if this year would finally be the one where their crops sold or rotted unsold. It was about communities that watched their youth leave home, chasing jobs that agriculture could no longer provide. It was about parents trying to raise children on farms that were slowly being priced out of existence by foreign imports so cheap they felt impossible to compete against. That kind of pressure doesn't just affect bank accounts. It affects dignity, and for once, dignity fought back. Across wide fields and small villages, old tools were pulled back into use. New cooperatives formed. Markets filled with baskets that finally carried homegrown labels again. What looks like a trade policy on paper became something deeply human on the ground. People feeding their own people. That is not economics. That is empowerment. But on the other side of the ocean, there were also families watching everything change with a heavy heart, producers who followed the rules, invested their life savings into farms, trusted global markets to remain stable, only to see the doors suddenly close. They didn't cause this shift. They're not villains in this story. They were simply caught in the same unstoppable transformation, one where old systems crack under new realities. In truth, both sides of this story share something deeply personal: the fear of losing a way of life, the pain of uncertainty, and the quiet hope that somehow stability still exists somewhere ahead. Yet moments like this teach us something lasting. Food is more than a commodity, it is power, security, and independence. When you can feed your people, you control your destiny. And when you cannot, someone else controls it for you. For generations, nations across Africa watched control drift away, one shipment, one import deal, one closed farm at a time. Now they are trying to pull that control back home, not with speeches, not with slogans, but with soil, sweat, and self-belief. This is a reminder for the entire world. True, wealth isn't measured only in currency. It's measured in the resilience of communities, in the ability to stand when global forces shift, in the choice to build instead of beg. The future won't belong to the loudest country, or the richest company, or the biggest exporter. The future will belong to the people willing to grow what they need, protect what they build, and fight quietly for independence instead of dependency. No matter where you're watching from, Africa, America, or anywhere between, this moment touches all of us. Because we all eat, we all depend on farmers we will never meet, and every loaf of bread, every chicken breast, every bag of grain carries the story of someone's labor, someone's sacrifice, someone's hope. So the next time you see food on your table, pause for just a second. Think about the hands that grew it, think about the communities that relied on its sale to survive, and think about the invisible battles playing out behind every price tag. This story didn't end with $1 billion lost. It began with millions of people rising to claim ownership of their food, their work, and their future. And while world leaders argue over trade deals and profit margins, ordinary people will keep planting seeds, because seeds don't care about politics, they only care about faith. Faith that the world can still grow something fair, something local, something powerful. And maybe that's the greatest lesson of all: when people reclaim the right to feed themselves, they don't just change markets, they change history.